Hello, Croiso Fulcher, welcome back to the channel. Old boy here. Today we're going to build on top of what we've already covered. Last episode we looked at the language being used to describe Cuchulainn and compared this to the language used in the PGM and Mithras liturgy. Now at the end of the last episode I mentioned how there seems to be a connection in the Irish mythology to a person who is known to be involved in certain cult practices elsewhere in the world. And that person is Simon Magus. So today we're going to be looking at how exactly he appears in the mythology, what he's doing. We're going to have a look at the practices of Simon Magus and his followers, and we're going to be looking at why the Celtic Christians, such as the Picts and Britons, seem to have adopted a practice of cutting the hair in the style of Simon Magus, as well as following the date of Easter, the observation of the date of Easter, which was also observed by Simon Magus and his followers. So, that's what we're looking at today. Let's jump right into it. Now, this first excerpt is from the Tambo Cooley, and it's chapter 17b, the Scythe Chariot. Let's take a look. Quote, "Thereupon the charioteer arose, and donned his yeoman's suit for charioteering. Of this yeoman's suit, this is what he put on him. His soft kirtle of skin, which was light and airy, which was smooth and sparkling, which was stitched and of buckskin, so that it hindered not the movements of his arms outside. Over that he put outside an overmantle of raven feathers, which Simon Magus had made as a gift for Darius Nero, king of the Romans. Darius bestowed it upon Conovar, Conovar gave it to Cuchulainn, Cuchulainn presented it to his charioteer. Then he cast a spell of concealment over his horses and over his fellow, so that they were not visible to any one in the camp, while all in the camp were visible to them. Well indeed was it that he cast that charm, for on that day the charioteer had to perform the three gifts of charioteership, namely, leaping over a cleft in the ranks, unerring driving, and the handling of the goad." End quote. Okay, so as you can see, there's mention of Simon Magus as well as this raven feather mantle, which was worn by Cuchulainn's charioteer. The mantle is described as passing hands from Simon Magus to Darius Nero, king of the Romans, then to Conovar, through to Cuchulainn, and finally to his charioteer. Also take note of how the charioteer casts a spell of concealment. This is one of many spells we find throughout the mythology, and perhaps we'll have a look at these spells later down the line. It's also pertinent to note that the PGM contains spells for concealment and invisibility as well. Now the Tain isn't the only place that we find mention of Simon amongst the mythologies of Ireland. We find a further connection to him in the stories related to a legendary Irish druid who goes by the name of Mog Ruith. Mogruth appears in the Yellow Book of Lecan and the Book of Ballymote. Stories about Mogruth are set in various periods of Irish history. Some say he lived during the reign of 3rd century High King Cormac MacArt, while others put him in Jerusalem during the time of Christ. The various medieval legends about his adventures in the Holy Land at the dawn of Christendom paint him as an interesting and mysterious character, a defender of paganism and an enemy of Christianity. He is also said to have been a student of Simon Magus, who taught him his magic skills and helped him build Rothramach. Mogruth's daughter was Tacta, a powerful druidess who gave a name to a hill on County Meath, and a festival celebrated there. Tacta, who was raped by Simon Magus while her father was learning magic, gave birth to 3 sons. End quote. Let's now take a look at some other sources to see what they've got to say about Mogruth. The first source is Irish Text Volume 3, 1897, which is quoting the Yellow Book of Lecan. Quote, "Mog Ruith, whence is it? Easy to say. Ruth, son of Rigol, fostered him. A famous druid was that Ruth, hence he was called Mog Ruith, Ruth's servant, or Mog Ruith, that is, Magus Retarum. For 'tis by wheels that he used to make his magical observations. Since Mogruth did service to that Ruth son of Rigol, he was called Mogruth. Tain was his name at first, till Mogruth was put upon him. It endeth." End quote. Okay, so Mogruth was originally called Tain, a name which means Lord, which would later be given to saints. The author explains that the meaning of the name Mogruth is Magus Retarum, meaning Magus of the Wheels in Latin, in reference to the magical observations he made using wheels. Could this be an allusion to a device used to make astronomical observations? As we've seen in a previous episode, knowledge of the universe, or physiologia, is found referenced to the practices of the Druids in classical sources. We also see in the Vita Merlini by Geoffrey of Monmouth that Merlin would derive his prophecies from watching the movements of the planets and stars. In the legend of Mogruth, also from the Yellow Book of Lecan, we find the following references to Simon. There, a druid said to him, "If this was the druidic art you had learnt today, your name would be famous throughout Ireland." "I will learn it," declared Mogruth. He learnt it when he was a famous sage in Ireland. He then went to the druid Simon to learn with him. Mogruth spent 33 years with Simon. End quote. In The History of Tacta, we hear how Tacta, daughter of Mogruth, travels with the father to work with Simon, who is described as Simon 7 times splendid. According to this version of the story, she creates the magic wheel alongside her father and Simon. Here the 3 sons of Simon are said to have given 3 sons to the daughter of Mog. Quote, "Mog's daughter went with thousands, Tacta the chosen one, not that she was without feelings, to accompany his noble and great father towards the proud Simon 7 times splendid. 3 sons had Simon, pleasant to look at, painful his struggle against their devils, powerful. It was a powerful, passionate and determined family. The 3 sons were on fire for Tacta at the same time. They begotten in her, that's no lie, a beautiful and noble descent. For Trian, without taking pride in it, Tacta created the moving red wheel, with the great and noble Mogruth, and with Simon 7 times splendid." End quote. Now, in a dictionary of Celtic religion and culture, Bernard Meyer mentions a period of time when Mogruth was said to have lived, the 1st or the 3rd century AD. He also mentions how Mog was trained by both the Druids of Ireland and by Simon Magus. Quote, "Mogruth, a druid versed in magic, said to have lived in the 1st or 3rd century AD. According to a story preserved in the Yellow Book of Lecan and in the Book of Ballymote, he was the son of an Irish sage and a British slave girl taken in war. His tutors in the magical arts are said to be not only the Druids of Ireland, but also the magician Simon." End quote. Dudley Wright, in his book Druidism, the Ancient Faith in Britain, once again mentions how Mog and his daughter travelled to study under Simon Magus. He also mentions again how parts of the wheel were supposedly brought back to Ireland. Quote, "The mythical creation known as Rothfael, or Fael's Wheel, and Rothramak, or the wheel with paddles, is said to have been made by Simon Magus, assisted by Mogruth, a celebrated Irish druid from the island of Valencia, who, having learned all the druidism or magic that could be learnt on these islands, went with his daughter to take lessons from Simon Magus, in whose contest with St. Peter he is represented as taking a part. The wheel was to enable Simon to sail in the air, but it met with an accident. Mogruth's daughter brought certain fragments of it to Ireland, one of which she fixed to the rock or pillar stone in a place near Tipperary, the name of which has been anglicised into Cleghill." Okay, so we've just looked at the mythology. Do we now have any other avenues to pursue which could lead us to further information? Now, as it happens, we find letters from the early 8th century which mention something described as the Simon Magus Tonsure, a tonsure, of course, being the method of the cutting of the hair of monks and clergymen. The letters, the first of which comes from Abbot Colfrid, an Anglo-Saxon Christian abbot, to Nechtan, king of the Picts, and the second from Aldhelm, who was the bishop and abbot from the royal house of Wessex, to Geraint, the king of British Dumnonia. These letters tell us that the Pictish and British Dumnonian churches were adhering to the practice of wearing the Simon Magus tonsure, and were also observing the date of Easter based on what were deemed as these alternative teachings. Aldhelm writes that the tonsure was worn in honour of the Dumnonian Church's founder and predecessors, who is described as Simon, the founder of the magical art. Abbot Colfrid, in his letter to the Picts, describes how the English Saxon Church was styled in line with the Roman Apostolic Church and described the practices of the Celtic Church as heretical. Overall, a general mission of the letters is to get these rulers and their regions to fall in line under Roman Apostolic authority, and it seemingly worked. Nechtan agrees for the Picts under his rule to conform to this framework and even ask for masons to be sent so they could build one of their churches in the area. Geraint of Dumnonia also agreed to comply. Let's now take a quick look at what Thomas Falconberry has to say about the tonsure in his book Out of the Mist. Monastic tonsure. Quote, "The early material referring to the Celtic tonsure emphasises its distinctiveness from the Roman alternative and invariably connects its use to the Celtic dating of Easter. Those preferring the Roman tonsure consider the Celtic custom extremely unorthodox and associated it with the form of tonsure worn by the heresiarch Simon Magus. According to the Catholic Encyclopedia, British monks shaved their heads in front of a line drawn from ear to ear. This was nicknamed tonsura magorum. Later, the Roman party jeered at it as the tonsura Simonis Magi, in contradistinction to their tonsure of St. Peter. The exact shape of the Irish tonsure is unclear from early sources, although they agree that the hair was in some way shorn over the head from ear to ear." End quote. Now let's compare this description of the tonsure with the description of Cuchulainn from the Tain, which we looked at in the last episode, and this is from chapter 7b in the Tambo Kulnia. Quote, 50 strands of bright yellow hair from one ear to the other, like a comb of birch twigs or like a brooch of pale gold in the face of the sun. A clear white shorn spot was upon him as if a cow had licked it." End quote. Granted, the description isn't enough to go off to prove that Cuchulainn was wearing the Simon Magus tonsure, but the description of the two does indeed have a general similarity, both mentioning the hair being cut from ear to ear, with a portion of it being shaved. Let us now look at the letter from Abbot Colfrid to Nechtan, king of the Picts, as recorded by Bede. Quote, "At that time, Nechtan, king of the Picts, who inhabited the northern parts of Britain, taught by frequent meditation on the ecclesiastical writings, renounced the error whereby he and his nation had been holden till then, touching the observance of Easter, and brought himself and all his people to celebrate the Catholic time of our Lord's resurrection. To the end that he might bring this to pass, with the more ease and greater authority, he sought aid from the English, whom he knew to have long since framed their religion after the example of the Holy Roman Apostolic Church. He also prayed to have master builders sent to him to build a church of stone in his nation after the Roman manner, promising to dedicate the same in honour of the blessed chief of the apostles. Moreover, he and all his people, he said, would always follow the custom of the Holy Roman Apostolic Church, in so far as men so distant from the speech and nation of the Romans could learn it. The most reverend Abbot Colfrid, favourably receiving his godly desires and requests, sent the builders he desired, and likewise the following letter." And then it quotes the letter, quote, "To the most excellent Lord and glorious King Nechtan, Abbot Colfrid, greeting in the Lord. We most readily and willingly endeavour, according to your desire, to make known to you the Catholic observance of Holy Easter, according to what we have learnt of the Apostolic See, even as you, most devout King, in your godly zeal, have requested of us." And then it goes on. "But having said thus, much briefly and succinctly, as you require concerning Easter, I also exhort you to take heed that the tonsure, concerning which likewise you desire me to write to you, be in accordance with the use of the Church and the Christian faith." And then it goes on. "But as for the tonsure which Simon Magus is said to have used, who is there of the faithful, I ask you, who does not straightway detest and reject it at the first sight of it, together with his magic? Above the forehead it does seem indeed to resemble a crown, but when you come to look at the neck, you will find the crown cut short, which you thought you saw, so that you may perceive that such a use properly belongs not to Christians, but to simoniacs. such as were indeed in this life by erring men thought worthy of the glory of an everlasting crown, but in that which is to follow this life are not only deprived of all hope of a crown, but are moreover condemned to eternal punishment." End quote. Okay, and now here is the letter from Aldhelm to Geraint, King of Dumnonia. And this is from Aldhelm's prose works. Quote, "To the most glorious King Geraint, the Lord who guides the sceptre of the Western Kingdom, whom I embrace with fraternal charity, as he who scrutinises my heart and inwards is witness, and likewise to all, the bishops of God abiding throughout Devon. Recently, when I was present at an episcopal council, where out of almost the entirety of Britain an innumerable company of the bishops of God came together, having assembled for this purpose expressly, that out of concern for the churches and the salvation of souls, the decrees of the canons and the statutes of the church fathers might be discussed by all and be maintained in common, with Christ offering his protection. When all these matters were duly accomplished, the entire episcopal council compelled my insignificant self with like precept and similar sentiment to direct epistolary letters to the presence of your loyalty, and through the style of writing to intimate their fatherly request and wholesome suggestion, that is, respecting the unity of the Catholic Church and the harmony of the Christian religion, without which an indifferent faith grows sluggish and future gain is exhausted. For what profit the emoluments of good works if they are performed outside the Catholic Church? Even if someone should meticulously carry out the rules of practice of a rigid life according to monastic discipline, or with fixed purpose decline the companionship of mortals. Finally, a rumour hostile to the faith of the Church has bruited it about far and wide that there are in your province certain bishops and clerics who obstinately refuse the tonsure of St. Peter, Prince of the Apostles, and persist in defending themselves with the apology that they intimate the tonsure of their founders and predecessors, whom they argue with assertions to have been illuminated by divine grace. And if these should be concerned to learn from us who was the first to employ this manner of shaving or tonsure, they fall dumb, either not knowing the truth or concealing the falsehood. However, we have learned that the author of this mode of tonsure, in the opinion of many, was Simon, the founder of the magical art. The struggle of the Apostles and the 10 books of Clement give witness to what sort of how great was the deception of necromancy that he fraudulently devised against the blessed Peter." End quote. Okay, so who was Simon Magus? First, we're just going to have a little general overview from Wikipedia, and then we're going to have a look at the practices of Simon Magus as they are recorded by the Christian author Hippolytus. Quote, "Simon Magus, also known as Simon the Sorcerer or Simon the Magician, was a religious figure whose confrontation with Peter is recorded in the Acts of the Apostles. According to Acts, Simon was a Samaritan magus or religious figure of the 1st century AD and a convert to Christianity, baptised by Philip the Evangelist. Okay, so he could have actually been a contemporary of Mog Ruith, who was said to have been around in either the 1st or the 3rd century. Surviving traditions about Simon appear in Orthodox texts, such as those of Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, Hippolytus and Epiphanius, where he is often described as the founder of Gnosticism, which has been accepted by some modern scholars, while others reject claims that he was a Gnostic, maintaining that he was merely considered to be one by the Church Fathers. In apocryphal works, including the Acts of Peter, Pseudo-Clementines and the Epistle of the Apostles, Simon also appears as a formidable sorcerer with the ability to levitate and fly at will." End quote. Okay, so as you can see, Simon is described as a Samaritan magus. He's described as converting to Christianity, but later seemingly clashed with Peter. Descriptions of the practices of Simon do come down to us through other authors, and we're going to be taking a look at what Hippolytus has to say next. But it's worth bearing in mind that some of the descriptions come from Orthodox Christian authors, and the accounts view Simon as a heretic. So naturally we have to account for the religious bias which such authors hold. Let's now take a look at what the Christian author Eusebius has to say about the Gnostics. Quote, Menander, who succeeded Simon Magus, showed himself in his conduct another instrument of diabolical power not inferior to the former. He also was a Samaritan, and carried his sorceries to no less an extent than his teacher had done, and at the same time revelled in still more marvellous tales than he. For he said that he was himself the Saviour, who had been sent down from invisible aeons for the salvation of men, and he taught that no one could gain the mastery over the world-creating angels themselves unless he had first gone through the magical discipline imparted by him and had received baptism from him. Those who were deemed worthy of this would partake even in the present life of perpetual immortality, and would never die but would remain here forever, and without growing old become immortal. These facts can easily be learned from the works of Irenaeus. And Justin, in the passage in which he mentions Simon, gives an account of this man also in the following words. And we know that a certain Menander, who was also a Samaritan from the village of Caparatia, was a disciple of Simon, and that he also, being driven by the demons, came to Antioch, and deceived many by his magical art, and he persuaded his followers that they should not die, and there are still some of them that assert this." End quote. Okay, so as you can see from that account, Jesus wasn't the only person who was walking around saying he was the Saviour, offering salvation and immortality. Finally, let's take a look at the Christian author Hippolytus, and let's see what he has to say about Simon and the Gnostics. Quote, "It seems then expedient likewise to explain now the opinions of Simon, the native of Gitta, a village of Samaria. And we shall also prove that his successors, taking the starting point from him, have endeavoured to establish similar opinions under the change of name. This Simon, being an adept in sorceries, both making a mockery of many, partly according to the art of Thrasymedes, in the manner of which we have explained above, and partly also by the assistance of demons, perpetrating his villainy, attempted to deify himself. But the man was a mere cheat and full of folly, and the apostles reproved him in the Acts. With much greater wisdom and moderation than Simon did Apsethus the Libyan, inflamed with a similar wish, endeavour to have himself considered a god in Libya." End quote. Okay, so as we can see, there is a theme being discussed here by Hippolytus which is similar to what Eusebius was saying in the previous excerpt regarding Menander travelling around offering salvation as a saviour figure. Here we have mentioned to another person doing a similar thing, but in Libya. Here Hippolytus states Simon and Apsethus were seeking deification, but states their practices were sorceries and deceptions, presumably as they are practices deemed heretical by the time an orthodoxy was being established. Okay, here's some more from Hippolytus. Quote, "In this way we must think concerning Simon the magician, so that we may compare him unto the Libyan, far sooner than unto him, though man-made was in reality God. If, however, the assertion of this likeness is in itself accurate, and the sorcerer was the subject of a passion similar to Apsethus, let us endeavour to teach anew the parrots of Simon that Christ, who stood, stands, and will stands, that is, was, is, and is to come, was not Simon." End quote. Okay, notice the choice of words Hippolytus uses to describe Christ as someone who stood, stands, and will stand, or he who was, is, and is to come. This is strikingly similar to how Calchas was referred to in the Iliad, which I'll just read out again. Quote, "When he had thus spoken, he sat down, and among them arose Calchas, son of Thestor, far the best of bird diviners, who knew the things that were to be, and that had been before." End quote. Next, we're going to look at a next section by Hippolytus. Here he mentions the similarities to Simon's teachings to the works of the Greek philosopher Heraclitus, as well as Plato and Aristotle. The mention of fire being the originating principle of the universe, and the allusion to its twofold nature, one seen, the other unseen, is very reminiscent of elements of the Mithras liturgy and the language which we find in the PGM, and the seen and unseen elements of Ion and Phanes, which we explored in a previous episode. Quote, "Now Simon, both foolishly and knavishly, paraphrasing the law of Moses, makes his statements in the following manner. For when Moses asserts that God is a burning and consuming fire, Taking what is said by Moses not in its correct sense, he affirms that fire is the originating principle of the universe. But Simon does not consider what the statement is which is made, namely, it is not that God is a fire, but a burning and consuming fire, thereby not only putting a violent sense upon the actual law of Moses, but even plagiarizing from Heraclitus the Obscure. And Simon denominates the originating principle of the universe as indefinite power, expressing himself thus, quote, "This is the treatise of a revelation of the voice and name, recognizable by means of intellectual apprehension of the great indefinite power. Wherefore it will be sealed and kept secret and hid, and will repose in the habitation and the foundation of which lies the root of all things." End quote. And he asserts that this man who is born of blood is habitation, and that in him resides an indefinite power, which he affirms to be the root of the universe. Now the indefinite power, which is fire, constitutes, according to Simon, not any uncompounded essence in conformity with the opinion of those who assert that the four elements are simple, and who have therefore likewise imagined that fire, which is one of the four, is simple. But this is far from being the case, for there is, he maintains, a certain twofold nature of fire, and of this twofold nature he denominates one part of something secret and another as something manifest, and that the secret are hidden in the manifest portions of the fire, and that the manifest portions of the fire derive their being from its secret portions. This, however, is what Aristotle denominates by the expressions of potentiality and energy, or what Plato styles intelligible and sensible. And the manifest portion of the fire comprises all things in itself, whatsoever any one might discern, or even whatever objects of the visible creation he may happen to overlook. But the entire secret portions of the fire, which one may discern, is cognized by intellect, and evades the power of the senses, or one fails to observe it, from want of a capacity for that particular sort of perception. In general, however, insomuch as all existing things fall under the categories, namely of what are objects of sense and what are objects of intellect, and as for the denomination of these, Simon employs the terms secret and manifest. It may, I say in general, be affirmed that the fire, I mean the super-celestial fire, is a treasure, as it were a large tree, just such as one as in a dream which was seen by Nebuchadnezzar, out of which all flesh is nourished. End quote. Next, Hippolytus speaks about how Simon seemed to follow a similar belief to that held by Empedocles, who talks about how the universe is composed of the four elements, earth, water, air and fire, and that those four elements are simple, eternal, and also brought into union and division by two powers which he called love and strife respectively. And so here's what Hippolytus has to say on that quote. Now, to express myself briefly insomuch as the fire is of this description, according to Simon, and since all things are visible and invisible, and in like manner resonant and not resident, numerable and not subjects of numeration, he denominates the great announcement a perfect intelligible entity, after such a mode that each of those things which, existing indefinitely, may be infinitely comprehended, both speaks and understands, and acts in a manner as Empedocles speaks of. And then he gives a quote from Empedocles. For earth indeed by earth we see, and water by water, and air divine by air, and fire fierce by fire, and love by love, and also strife by gloomy strife. End quote. Hippolytus goes on to describe Simon's system, which was called a threefold emanation by pairs. Quote, for he says he is in the habit of considering that all these portions of the fire, both visible and invisible, were possessed of perception and a share of intelligence. The world, therefore, that which is generated, was produced from the unbegotten fire. It began, however, to exist, he says, according to the following manner. He who was begotten from the principle of that fire took 6 roots, and those primary ones of the originating principle of generation. And he says that the roots were made from the fire in pairs, which roots he terms mind and intelligence, voice and name, ratiocination, and reflection, and that in these 6 roots resides simultaneously the entire indefinite power potentially, however not actually. And this indefinite power, he says, is he who stood, stands, and will stand. We're hearing this similar phrase being used again. Wherefore, whenever he may be made into an image, insomuch as he exists in the 6 powers, he will exist there substantially, potentially, quantitatively, and completely. And he will be a power, one and the same with the unbegotten and indefinite power, and not labouring under any great deficiency that the unbegotten and unalterable and indefinite power. If, however, he may continue only potentially in the 6 powers, and has not been formed into an image, he vanishes, he says, and is destroyed in such a way as the grammatical or geometrical capacity of man's soul. For when the capacity takes unto itself an art, a light of existent things is produced. But when the capacity does not take unto itself an art, unskilfulness and ignorance are the results. And just as when the power was non-existent, it perishes along with the expiring man." End quote. Okay, this next section seems to have certain similarities with the Chaldean oracles, which was a text which was widely debated by the Neoplatonists, including Porphyry, Iamblichus and Proculus, who wrote extensive commentaries on them. The basic concepts of the oracles explain there to be an absolute transcendent deity residing outside of time and space, who produces a power which was named intellect. This intellect is said to contemplate purely intellectual forms in the realms it resides, while creating and governing the material realm in a dualistic nature. The aspect relating to the governance of the material realm was referred to as the demiurge, a word which literally means a skilled workman or handicraftsman, and was then used by Plato to designate the maker of the physical world. The oracles also include what is described as a boundary between the intellectual fire which resides outside of the physical realm and that of the material fire of the cosmos, which they personified as Hecate, who also acts as a mediator between the divine influence and the physical realm. From Hecate it is said that the world soul is derived, and from this comes nature, which governs what is called the sublunar realm. This sublunar realm is described as the parts of the cosmos which reside below the moon, everything contained within which was said to be composed of the 4 classical elements: earth, air, fire and water. This realm was considered to be the only place where the power of physics held sway, the Platonists seemingly including these powers under the title of nature, which I just mentioned. From nature then came fate, which was said to enslave the lower human soul, and the goal of existence was to purify this lower soul in order to achieve salvation by ascending through the 7 planetary spheres, casting off lower aspects of the self to become pure intellect. This is very reminiscent of the process of the Mithras liturgy, which we looked at in the previous episode, and may give us a hint as to why Simon Magus is referred to as Simon 7 times great in the Irish texts. Beneath the intelligible triad of father, Hecate and intellect are said to come 3 successively descending worlds called Empyrean, Ethereal and Elemental, which were said to be governed by lower demiurgic intellects. Okay, so now let's look at this next section, which I just want you to think about what I've just said, think about what I've mentioned in the oracles, and also the teachings of the Neoplatonists and Pythagoreans while I read this section out. Quote, "Therefore, according to this reasoning, Simon became confessedly a god to his silly followers as that Libyan, namely Absithus, begotten, no doubt, and subject to passion, when he may exist potentially, but devoid of propensions. And this too, though born from one having propensions, and uncreated though born, from one that is begotten, and he may have fashioned into a figure, and becoming perfect, may come forth from 2 of the primary powers, that is, heaven and earth. For Simon expressly speaks of this in the Revelation after this manner." And then he quotes Simon, "To you then I address the things which I speak, and to you I write what I write. The writing is this: there are 2 offshoots from all aeons, having neither beginning nor end, from one root, and this is a power, sige, which means silence in Greek, who is invisible and incomprehensible, and one of these offshoots appears from above, which constitutes a great power, the creative mind of the universe, which manages all things and is male. The other offshoot, however, is from below, and constitutes a great intelligence, and is a female, which produces all things. From whence, ranged in pairs opposite each other, they undergo conjugal union, and manifest an intermediate interval, namely an incomprehensible heir, which has neither beginning nor end. But in this is a Father who sustains all things, and nourishes things that have beginning and end. This is he who stood, stands, and will stand, being a hermaphrodite power, according to the pre-existent indefinite power, which has neither beginning nor end. Now this power exists in isolation, for intelligence that subsists in unity proceeded forth from this power and became two. And that Father was one, for having in himself this power, he was isolated, and, however, he was not primal though pre-existent. But being rendered manifest to himself from himself, he passed into a state of duality. But neither he was denominated Father before this power would style him Father. As therefore he himself, bringing forward himself by means of himself, manifested unto himself his own peculiar intelligence, and also the intelligence, when it was manifested, did not exercise the function of creation. But beholding him, she concealed the Father within herself, that is the power, and it is an hermaphrodite power, and an intelligence, and hence it is that they are ranged in pairs, one opposite the other, for power is in no wise different from intelligence, insomuch as they are one. For from those things that are above they discover power, and from those below intelligence. So it is therefore that likewise what is manifested from these, being unity, is discovered to be duality, a hermaphrodite having the female in itself. This, therefore, is mind subsisting in intelligence, and these are separable one from another, though both taken together are one and are discovered in a state of duality." End quote. Okay, so to summarise, we find mention of Simon Magus in the Irish mythology, including the Tain. Here Cuchulainn has possession of a raven feather mantle, which was said to come from Simon. We also find mention of Simon with regards to the druid Mog Ruith, who features in the Yellow Book of Nechtan. Mog was said to have been trained by the Druids as well as Simon. We find letters which were sent from the Saxon bishops to the British and Pictish kings in an attempt to bring them into line with apostolic Catholicism, with a specific mention of the tonsure their clergy wore, which was said to be the style of tonsure which originated with Simon Magus. The description of the Simon Magus tonsure is surprisingly similar to the way Cuchulainn's hair is described in the Tain. Early Christian sects are described as incorporating elements of the mystery religions as well as that of the Pythagoreans and the Neoplatonists. This is evident in the descriptions of Simon's practices as outlined by Hippolytus. We can also see that Jesus wasn't the only person walking around saying that they were the Saviour. There were certainly others, as we can see from the texts. As a Christian orthodoxy came together, sects which did not adhere to said orthodoxy were branded heretical even in retrospect. Was it because it included the aforementioned elements which were relatively familiar to their original Druidic beliefs? We may never know the answer, but it certainly opens the door for further contemplation and further investigation. So thanks again for watching. I really appreciate the support. Let me know your thoughts and feelings in the comments below, and I'll catch you for the next one. Thanks again. Old Boy out.